reading experiments that we've been doing. Now, these aren't revolutionary or earth-shattering. They have been very indicative for us of some very interesting things. We've been working with a very small school where, at the end of the first semester, teachers have come to realize that individuals in this school don't seem to read fast enough. They don't seem able to absorb the amount of reading they have in their college classes. And we've had those students taken out and put in an experimental group. One wonders why reading difficulties carry on into the university, but then the moment one realizes the size of classes that teachers have to put up with in the lower grades, it isn't surprising that youngsters don't get to learn to read. Teaching of reading, as well as other things, is a remarkably personal process, and it's awfully difficult to get personal with a crowded classroom. But to come on back to my experiment. These youngsters who seem unable to read, according to their teachers, are put in a group. And the very first thing we do when we get them is to send them off to an education clinic, a reading clinic, to see if anything's wrong with their eyes. And immediately, about 20% of those students are released because they do need glasses or they do need corrective mechanical work with their eyes. The remaining come back. We give them a number of tests, and I have no time to describe all of the tests, but I should like to describe just one little bit of one of them. One of the tests consists, it's really not a test, it's a little game, is a letter 3 pages long that Thomas Jefferson once wrote to a friend of his. And in the letter, Jefferson is arguing the values of the democratic process, the values of a good deal of education. He's saying only in a free democratic community in which everybody has an opportunity to get an education can we discover whether people have the capacity or not. And he goes on tying up the great agrarian development in this country with the necessity of great education and so on. We give this 3-page letter to which, or in which, I have made one small addition. I've added the following, which Thomas Jefferson never did write. And the following is this. And anybody who really believes that I, Thomas Jefferson, am in favor of a democratic society misunderstands me completely, because I think most people are too dumb to learn, most people shouldn't be taught anyway, most people need to be pushed around by the rest of us. Period. I just insert that about midway on page 3 and ask the students, please read this whole letter carefully and come back tomorrow. Our instructions are, please read this carefully. When they return tomorrow, we give them a quiz on the letter. The quiz is very simple, and I just ask you to think of question number 6. Question number 6 is this. At any point in this letter, did Mr. Jefferson have any doubts about the democratic process? Did he think it might not work? Did he indicate that he was opposed to it? 79, almost 80% of all the students we've studied, something like 250 now, say no to question 6. Now, why do they say no? We then assign each of these students to a clinical psychologist for conversation. And they sit down with one objective. Why did you give the answer you did to question number 6, along with a lot of other things? And they may sit for 2 hours, 6 hours, 8, 10, 12 hours, until we find out, or until we get some information. Now, so far, the thing that is most fascinating from my point of view is this. In these conversations, almost 2 out of 3, that is, it's 64% of all of these students, proceed ultimately in the conversation to break down and say something like this. Well, okay, so I didn't read it. And then when the probing goes on, we're astonished to discover that it isn't that these students can't read, it is simply that they don't. And why don't they? Well, as they say it, freedom, agrarianism, democracy, that's old stuff. Everybody knows that. And we now have come to wonder whether it is correct to say that these people can't read or simply that they don't. And why don't they? Well, if I've come to believe that I already know what's on the sheet, why do I bother to look at it? And thus, for us, the problem in helping youngsters to read may well become part of the greater process of teaching youngsters to be teachable. We've done the same thing with truck drivers and office people in a number of large corporations in Chicago. We did the same thing with the truck drivers who had to listen to safety talks and demonstrations and movies about once a week. We interviewed them at great length in an attempt to find out what they got from these educational sessions. And we were astonished over and over. They seemed to listen, but they never heard. When we asked them about what they saw, they seemed not to be able to know the details. They didn't remember them. And then when we asked them why not, in these interview situations, over and over they would say something like, oh, this speeding safety, everybody knows that. And thus, for us, the first step somehow in the achievement of that sense of teachability, how to become sensitive to the greatness and vastness of what there is, it seems to us that involves helping people to remember the et cetera. A homely illustration. A farmer doesn't take a handful of seed and throw them into an open field and expect that they'll take root. No. First, he prepares the soil. He breaks it up. He conditions the soil for the reception of the seed. We now have come to believe that youngsters and oldsters too, perhaps, need preparing, conditioning for more reception. I wish I could describe how many of our habits of talking somehow lead to a feeling that what I've said is all there is to be said. Think, for example, when we call people things. We say, he's a slow student, period. Or that man is a criminal, period. Note the implications of that's what he is and that's all he is. Or in the illustration I gave in the previous session, General Patton says, he's a coward. And that's all he is. And it is that implication and that's all he is that we think is the first step towards the imprisonment of the human mind. And if we could do anything to create a sensitivity that there is more, we might somehow reduce the arrogance and the intransigence that comes when people talk together. Several years ago, at a conference on science, philosophy, and religion at Columbia, a spokesman for a particular group arose and bluntly said this. The conference had been discussing problems for 2 or 3 days, and the spokesman arose and said, we knew what we believed before we came here. These talks haven't changed our beliefs. Even if you prove we're wrong, which I don't think you can do, we'll still leave believing the same things we did when we came in the door. Now, how much learning took place? What happened in this particular moment? What went on to enrich the outlook and the perceptions of the individual? It's very difficult to talk about this thing called allness because it isn't anything solid that you can point to. It's an attitude. It's a point of view. And perhaps I can do nothing more than indicate the directions that point of view takes. We see it in loads of ways. We see it in an adult who will cut off a youngster trying to make an explanation. We'll see it in a teacher who acts as if what she says brooks no further questioning. And incidentally, we've come to feel that teachers and supervisors and officers ought to be very wary of the allness in their talking because of something very interesting that happens. Let this be a teacher or a parent, and this be the student, or let this be an officer and an enlisted man, or a non-commissioned officer and an enlisted man. If this person radiates allness, it just doesn't vanish into the air. If you are at the end of the receiving of allness talk, you don't just stop, you freeze up too. We've observed that employees in an office, when a supervisor is full of arrogance and allness, it comes back. It radiates and it reverberates. And the first thing you know, the reverberation is so great that the wall that separates man from man gets built up. And thus, when allness exists, there also exists tension. And there exists also these things which tend to prevent the development and growth of the individual.